What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and with the second Spider-Man trailer dropping last night and everybody talking about Spider-Man today, I thought we might sidetrack from Edge of Spider-Verse for a quick second. Don't worry, we'll pick back up with it tomorrow, I promise. And we're going to cover the story where Spider-Man meets God, i.e. Spider-Man meets the one above all. We have done videos explaining the one above all. We did a Beyond Omega level video on the one above all. We never covered the story where Spider-Man met him, right? Which is basically Spider-Man Back in Black. It's part of Sensational Spider-Man, which was a really cool story. But this comes off the heels of the Civil War event. For those of you guys who read that, right? You guys know that in that story, as a testament to the fact that Peter Parker trusted Iron Man's position that it's in the best interest of the superhero community to register, that Peter Parker revealed his identity publicly. Now, this is kind of the unofficial, I guess, series of comics that basically dealt with that, right? So you had like Civil War where Peter Parker revealed his identity. You had this comic, which is one that not a lot of people know of. Then you go into One More Day, One Moment in Time, and Brand New Day, or basically that some variation of those three, right? And as a result of that, it kind of gives us this era where Peter Parker revealed his identity and then it was all basically undone. It was kind of the big reset for Spider-Man. The idea here is that it initially kind of covers the nature of Spider-Man, which is to say Peter Parker as a young kid who has by and large over the course of his life just experienced trials and tribulations and tragedies, right? He's lost the people that are closest to him, Uncle Ben, Gwen Stacy, things like that. But he also endured being bullied at school and being made fun of. And that kind of fit into the nature of Spider-Man, but it's also what made him famous, right? Spider-Man is like, it's weird when you think about Spider-Man, right? Because it's just Spider-Man. I don't know what it is. I've actually talked to a lot of you guys, talked to a lot of fans over the years at Comic-Cons or when I just happen to bump into you or something like that, and the topic of Spider-Man came up. And one of the things that I've asked is like, why do you love Spider-Man so much? And I've heard a bunch of different reasons. People have said things like, because it could be anybody under the mask, that Spider-Man was an escape for a lot of you. So you would read Spider-Man's comics because you could imagine yourself being Spider-Man, right? So you get revenge on Flash Thompson because he bullied you. You get the girl. You have to watch your girl die when she gets thrown off a bridge. Just all that kind of stuff. You know, but for real and for true, a lot of people love the character of Spider-Man because he's just the superhero that can't catch a break, that anybody could be him, right? He's struggling, trying to make his way, figuring out what it means to be a good guy, making mistakes, different things along those lines. There's a lot of relatable aspects to his character. And so, of course, as we know from the Spider-Man mythos, along the way, he ended up meeting Liz Allen. Now, the funny thing about Liz Allen is that she's kind of one of those unsung love interests of Peter Parker. And in fact, she's overlooked quite a bit when it comes to virtually any iteration of Spider-Man outside of comics. And rightfully so. I mean, it was one of those things where they were always kind of missing each other to a degree. The way this worked was that Liz Allen, she wasn't really cruel to Peter Parker, but she would kind of just sort of haze him a little bit alongside Flash Thompson. She wouldn't go out of her way to do it, but she never really seemed to concern herself with like the impact of Peter being bullied by Flash. Now, the funny thing about this is that as time progressed, she began to develop somewhat of a romantic interest in Peter, but by that point, he was already seeing Betty Brant. But during the time when she was kind of giving him a hard time, not in the most extreme, he actually had a crush on her. So by the time she realized that she had some measure of interest in him, he had already moved on. And so it was one of those things where for a while, Peter never really even considered the idea that Liz Allen having an interest in him was of anything significant. Now, one of the things that Stan Lee really tried to do in the early days of Marvel when he got into Amazing Spider-Man 4 and 5 and things like that, is there was this attempt to build up this almost kind of Lois Lane, Superman dichotomy there, in the sense that Liz Allen was actually in love with Spider-Man, but not knowing that Peter was Spider-Man, basically rebuked both Peter Parker and Flash Thompson. It didn't last all that long, and honestly, that's so far back in the letters pages or something I couldn't get my hands on that I'm not really even sure how fans responded to it, right? I don't know if they loved it or hated it. I mean, I have to imagine because a real romance never really blossomed between Peter and Liz Allen, that never really happened. Instead, it was basically Peter dating Betty Brant for a while. Him and Betty Brant basically split. He ended up getting with Gwen Stacy. She died, and then he got with Mary Jane Watson and was with her until the events of One More Day. So it's one of those things where like she's just kind of overlooked in a lot of different ways. But the important thing here is that in this particular segment, it kind of highlights the idea that in some ways she was there for him and in some ways she wasn't. She was kind of a person he could talk to, but there wasn't really a whole lot of love interest there. It seemed like something was blossoming, but nothing really seemed to happen all that much. And then of course, Peter Parker was bitten by a radioactive spider. And following that, and what's really interesting about this, you get this depiction where Peter believed that in the aftermath of becoming Spider-Man and essentially the increase in his life, right? The uptick in his life insofar as being a superhero, having enhanced strength and different things like that, that his life would actually become so much better, that he learned what is in effect the most popular lesson he would ever learn, which is with great great power must come great responsibility following the death of Uncle Ben. And that's when Peter's life just kind of, in some ways, became worse than it was before he was Spider-Man. When he wasn't Spider-Man and he was just Peter, his life was pretty straightforward, right? He was a kid trying to make his way through school, getting picked on, with the hope of the idea that one, the world's not a terrible place, having faith in the idea that the world is inherently good, that people who do bad things are usually doing it out of desperation or because they simply don't know any better, or at the very least having faith in the idea that those who are villains can be redeemed, to becoming Spider-Man who just consistently lost things, right? He lost Gwen Stacy, he lost Uncle Ben, just over and over and over again. But some of these losses he sustained were because of his own actions. Case in point, when the criminal escaped and Peter just let him go. And this guy ultimately ended up shooting Uncle Ben. And then Uncle Ben's death and Peter's realization that this guy was the one who did it culminated in Peter's understanding that he was basically the one that led to Uncle Ben dying. That Uncle Ben had told him time after time after time, with great power must come great responsibility. If you have the power to help, you have the responsibility to help, right? Just one facet of what that phrase means. Peter had the power to stop that criminal, but he avoided the responsibility of doing it. And the cost was the life of Uncle Ben. And that was one of the most significant moments in Peter's life. As most of you guys know, that was important because, as he states, that was devastating for Peter Parker in that the way it's said, his uncle's death was only the first of many trials Peter would endure over the years. That, of course, there were more deaths. His arch enemy, the Green Goblin, his first and some say truest love, Gwen Stacy, these are the kinds of things that he endured over and over and over again. That as a superhero, whether it's because he found himself in the crosshairs of villains who were looking to get to him by using his family, or because it was just people in the wrong place at the wrong time, Peter just lost things over and over and over again. And this particular aspect of Peter losing these things will actually become a very important talking point. But this kind of picks up in the most recent set of events, which is after having lost Uncle Ben and then losing Gwen Stacy, now he's got to contend with the idea of losing Aunt May to the gunshot that was meant for him after his identity went public and somebody tried to kill Peter. And so with that in mind, he actually ends up just kind of leaving, right? Taking some time for himself, focusing on all the things that he's lost over the course of his life. Harry Osborn, who is believed to have been dead, things along those lines, and in turn says like, I just need time for myself. And so instead of like going out, I mean, obviously Peter's pissed, but instead of going out and just beating criminals within an inch of their life, he ends up just beating up on a trash can, right? Which is, I mean, given the kind of strength he has, is the more responsible thing to do. But ultimately this guy just appears out of nowhere, right? Just kind of sneaks up on Peter, which is something that shouldn't be able to happen, appears out of nowhere. And when Peter turns around, getting ready to punch this guy, this dude's like, I'm not looking for any kind of trouble. And Peter's question is like, who are you and where did you come from? And that's when this guy responds, well, I was just walking by and I heard you pummeling that piece of city property and I thought, maybe I can help. So here's the thing, let me buy you a burger and we can talk about whatever it is that's bothering you. And that's when the situation itself really seems to dawn on Peter Parker when the guy refers to Peter by his name. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, because the world knows Peter Parker is Spider-Man, his response is, okay, whatever, man. Like, it's cool that like, who I am, but like everybody knows who I am. Not a great big huge deal. That doesn't really impress me all that much. And when the guy points to the fact that Peter's hands are all bloody and injured, he's like, well, it's fine. They'll heal themselves. And then this guy heals Peter's hands in an instant. And so Peter begins to start realizing something. He's like, wait a minute. You snuck up on me and my spider sense didn't go off. That's not possible. No one ever, the only people that could sneak up on me without my spider sense going off are like Venom and Carnage and like some other symbiote, or maybe somebody like Mysterio on a good day. So unless you're one of those guys and my spider sense would be telling me that something's wrong because I'm looking at you in your face, there's gotta be something going on. Who are you? And this guy's response is, come on, Peter, you know who I am. And he simply just emanates this kind of light. And Peter comes to the realization that it's basically God. Now, this is one of those times when you kind of have to read between the lines, right? That somebody just, emanating a bright light doesn't mean anything. Dazzler can do that. It doesn't mean that Dazzler's God. This is one of those situations where the one above all appears, and then just by virtue of his presence and whatever powers he uses, Peter knows that it's him, right? It's almost kind of like an instinctual thing, right? Like, I know it's you, right? Like, I know that you're basically God. And that's kind of the crazy thing, is because this is one of 17 times that the one above all has appeared in Marvel Comics. And appearing to Peter is an even more interesting thing, because what ends up happening is that once they get to their food, the one above all, is not acting the way you would expect God to act, right? He's like, you're not eating your burger or your fries. You got to keep your appetite up, man. You got to keep your strength up, And so Peter's like, okay, look, at that point, it's just like the elephant in the room. He's like, okay, we got to address this, man. I know you're like a super busy guy, you're omnipotent or whatever, and I'm just this fleck of thing, whatever, however you want to see me. He says, but since we're here, since we're breaking bread, he's like, maybe maybe you wouldn't mind telling me if my Aunt May dying is all part of your cosmic scheme, your grand design for my pitiful life. And the response of the one above all is, if I were to tell you that it was, what would you do, Peter? What would your response be to that? And the answer is, he wouldn't do anything because there's nothing he could do. He's quite literally sitting in the presence of God. This is an omnipotent, omniscient, indestructible force. And so Peter's only response, the only thing he can do is he says, I would beg you to save her, right? I would tell you, I'd give up anything to save her. And his response is, even being Spider-Man? And Peter says, in a heartbeat, right? And so at that point, it's like, if you could rewrite my life story so that the spider bites somebody else and I'm spared all the death that I've experienced over the years, my Uncle Ben, Gwen, her father, Harry, you could do that, right? And the one above all just kind of looks at him for a second and just basically says, I want to take you somewhere. And so what they end up doing is actually teleporting to Robert Moses Beach. Initially, Peter thinks it's Coney Island, but the one above all is right. He's like, I mean, everybody goes to Coney Island, man. Come on, dude. It's like me taking you to Central Park, right? Like everybody goes there. I'm not going to take you to a tourist trap, man. And so while they're here, the reason why this beach was chosen is because this is the place that Peter used to come with his Uncle Ben and Aunt May when he was a little kid. More so than that, as the two of them are talking, the one above all gives this really, really interesting insight into what it simply means to live. Because it's one of the things that you kind of have to contend with when you read comics. Superheroes experience loss and death and trial and tribulation and struggle all the time. Sometimes it's directly on the nose. Other times it's far less direct and far less impactful. But regardless, they all experience that. With Iron Man, it was alcoholism. It was losing people who were important to him. Happy Hogan dying at one point in time. You know, when it comes to somebody like Captain America, it was being thrown out of time. So losing everything that was important to him in his younger days. When you look at all these different characters who experience these losses and these struggles, they all cope with it in their different ways. And that's one of the things that Peter asks here, right? He's like, okay, so like, is this all just a test, right? Like, because if I'm being tested, then just let me fail, because I have to tell you, I'm this close to breaking. And the response of the one above all is, it's not a test. It simply just is. And so he says, human suffering is just one of the mysteries. It happens for no good reason. And the people who endure it, it doesn't even always make them better. You're one of the very rare situations, Peter Parker, where you become better because of the things that you've endured. Most people, it just makes them worse. It just makes them worse people. And that's an accurate statement, right? That's a true statement. It just makes them worse people. For most people in this world, with the trials and tribulations they endure, the struggles they face, they just usually give up, or they just kind of roll over, or they just become terrible, terrible, terrible people, right? It really kind of depends on the situation. But by and large, most people become worse because of the things that they endure. Peter Parker has become better. And where Peter doubts this, right? Where he's like, there's no way this can possibly be true. When the one above all says it happens though to everyone, it's hard to explain why it's necessary to someone who wasn't there when the foundation of the earth was laid or when the first walls were built around the oceans. Peter asks, then what's the point of anything then? If it's all beyond understanding, then what's the point of it? And the one above all says, well, for starters, they are, right? Like they are simply just part of the point. And what ends up happening is all these individuals who basically seem to have no inclination as to why they're there are all teleported to the beach. And all of these are lives of people that Peter has saved over his time as Spider-Man. And that's the big thing that the one above all is pointing out in terms of how Peter being Spider-Man has made people's lives better, has made him better as a person. Because whenever we endure things, right, we as people are things where we really don't see the value of something unless it's tangible, right? We say, okay, we are financially successful. Well, how do you measure that? My car, my house, my credit cards with ultra high limits, the things that I physically own. This is a testament to how I have become a better person. We very rarely ever look at the intangible things and use that as a determination of how we've improved as human beings, right? Like I was a person who came from nothing, now I have everything, and so I'm a charitable human being. I still treat people with respect. I still act the way that I did and live the way that I did back when I was poor, right? Never losing touch with your roots. We never really look at that as the standard of how it is that we've improved or become better in any number of the ways that happens over the course of our lives. Peter had forgotten that, right? The one above all says they're an itsy bitsy teeny weeny sampling of all the thousands upon thousands of people you've saved as Spider-Man over the years. Parents, children, grandparents, entire families. And so Peter's like, I mean, thousands really? And the one above all is like, I mean, yeah, I'm counting team ups, you know, but yeah, like you were involved in the saving of these people's lives. And so that's when it kind of dawns on Peter for a moment, even if it's not necessarily the all-encompassing answer he was looking for. Peter goes as far as say, like, you pass through their lives, right? You pass in and out of their lives in minutes or even seconds, and you forget that their lives continue after you swing away. They go back to their homes, their jobs, their apartments, and the one above all says, you saved all these people. Sometimes it was just swooping in and swooping out, and you never even knew what their faces looked like. Whatever the case is, these are all people you've saved. And where Peter thanks him, the one above all calls it, right? He says, you're welcome, though it doesn't really answer any of your questions. It doesn't make the suffering any more bearable, does it? And the response of Peter is no. And that's when the one above all basically comes out and tells Peter what it is that he wants to know, but doesn't give him the answer he wants to hear. But the one above all says, we all have a purpose, Peter. We all have a role to play. This, fortunately or unfortunately, is yours. And if it's any consolation, I've asked a lot more from people much closer to me than you. And so at that moment where Peter having this conversation with God and having this bit of a breakdown really just kind of says, I don't want my aunt to die. Please don't let her die. And the response of the one above all is simply, have faith, Peter. And that's what's so interesting about this, is that whenever you think of some being like the one above all, even in the scope of Marvel Comics, you almost kind of apply this concept or this desire that you wouldn't readily get in the real world, right? Like here in the real world, whenever you talk about a godly entity, whichever one you happen to pray to, if you pray to one at all, that is always one of these things like they move in mysterious ways, or it's all part of some grand plan. And I think a lot of that is humanity just trying to develop some method of understanding about the chaotic nature of the world. Well, the world's chaos and there's all kinds of crazy things that go on, and there's good things that happen to bad people and bad things that happen to good people. And so the only way to really justify that is to say, well, because it's all part of some grand plan. The opposite of that, the antithesis of that, is to say, because the world just is and things just happen. But what that does is it basically leans into the nature of disorder. It leans into the nature of the fact that there is no order here. There is no structure here. It's simply just a globe that spins around on its own axis that orbits the sun, and things just happen. And that with that kind of disorganization and that kind of chaos, people can't handle it. And so we in turn create order, we create structure, whether we attribute that to some greater deity out there, or we attribute it to something as basic as a social contract, we create that in order to keep ourselves sane in what would otherwise be a completely insane world. And so when you look at something like the one above all in Marvel Comics, that's what you expect. You expect that same concept to roll over here. But what Marvel says is, no, the one above all does not have any grand answers. It's not like the one above all comes along and says, well, here you go, Peter. Here's the answer to every question you ever wanted to know. And here's what your purpose is in life. And here is why everything that bad that's ever happened to you has happened to you. He doesn't really get that. The answers he gets from the one above all is, because Peter, struggling makes people better sometimes, and sometimes it makes people worse. That you as Spider-Man, despite all the struggles you've endured, have saved the lives of countless people. And that's the best I can give you. There's no grand plan here, right? I mean, it's like Vin Diesel said in Pitch Black, that God is a kid with an ant farm, right? He's got no plan whatsoever. And that seems to be the case. And this would fit in pretty neatly with the various depictions of the Marvel cosmic hierarchy as we've seen it over the years in Marvel Comics, right? Al Ewing and all these different guys, that in effect, God just set everything in motion, right? God's a prime mover. And then whatever happens, happens, and God just sits back and watches. And that seems to basically be it. And so it was kind of cool to see Peter having this conversation with God. And while he desires more than anything to get this sort of nuanced, finite understanding of quote unquote what it all means, the response of God is, there is no answer to what it all means. It's simply just, it just exists. You just have this life that you live, and you do your best to make the most of it, and you try to help people as often as you can by understanding the struggles you endured and how it can make you better, and then you die one day. And that's basically it. You lose people along the way, you gain people along the way, right? You lose parents, you gain kids. It's just kind of the way this process and this cycle works. And so it's cool. It's a really, really interesting conversation. Now, one of the things you kind of get here is a bit of a teaser, which never really seemed to come to fruition, that eventually Peter Parker, Mary Jane Watson get married, they have kids, they go on to have a great life. And so Peter ends up, eventually finding, real and true happiness. But by and large, the story's great, right? It's just a one-off little story here, just by itself. But basically Peter Parker meeting God. So let me know down in the comment section what you guys think about this. You guys dig it, or you guys kind of like, this is stupid. Let me know what you guys think. And I will catch you all later. Peace.